nominal growth into real growth versus inflation. That's the decomposition. Then we introduced this NGD curve, nominal growth decomposition curve, and how it is estimated for G7 countries. Finally, what would be ideal nominal growth rates of demand? So that's the plan of the talk. So first, to remind you about the costs of the two problems, two diseases, one of them being inflation, the other one being demand deficiency. Costs of inflation are better known in our country because we have lived through maybe more than 3 decades of inflation, high inflation after 1970s, after the oil price shocks. Until 2001, it was always double digits. And after the change in the central bank law in 2001, we managed actually to bring inflation down to single digits for almost 10 years, starting from 2004, I should say. But recently, there is also an increase in inflation in our country, so we know actually what's wrong with inflation, why it is bad. But empirical work across countries in the world find that inflation, if it is very high, it's going to reduce your potential growth. So the econometric estimate by Robert Barrow from a paper published in 2000, there's a 10 percentage points extra inflation, your potential growth will be reduced by 0.22 percentage points. So almost a quarter of a percentage point will be the cost of 10 extra percentage points higher inflation. Imagine that you have 50 percentage points higher inflation. That's going to reduce your potential real growth by 1 full percentage point, which is a big cost. But that requires a very high inflation. Double digits and close to 100% inflation would be detrimental to long-term economic growth. So that's well known. That's why many countries in the world are focused on price stability, which they mean a low and predictable rate of inflation. But how about the cost of demand deficiency? Obviously, the history of that goes at least back to John Maynard Keynes. So there is such a problem, in fact, and we also see it in the data, in recent data. So there is a separate problem about demand growth being too low. So inflation is about demand growth being too high. The other one, demand deficiency, is about demand growth being too low. So this presentation will be about what is the change breakpoint. So what's the breakpoint between inflation problem versus demand deficiency problem? That is an econometric and empirical work. So how about the cost of demand deficiency? In our paper, we find it as very high, like only 1 percentage points fall in nominal demand to the negative territory, let's say, reduces your output, your real GDP, real production, by 0.75%. So it is 75% of the demand deficiency is reflected directly to the real production, but that is an acute problem. Acute means sudden, immediate effect. It's unlike the cost of inflation, which is a long-run detrimental effect on potential growth. This is an acute, sudden problem, and that was the reason why Keynes wrote all the books. Actually, he has written. The most famous one is the General Theory. So he said, at any cost, the government should somehow avoid demand deficiency problem by expansionary policies, because it is very costly in the short term. So that's about demand deficiency. So let me show you our empirical data. So the blue points are to be read as follows. The horizontal axis is nominal growth, nominal GDP growth. What does nominal mean? In terms of domestic currency, in terms of your local currency, what was the total expenditure last year? What is your total expenditure this year in the country? You take the percentage difference, the total amount of spending in terms of money, the percentage change from the previous year. that is called annual nominal GDP growth. Okay, that's the horizontal axis. What's the vertical axis? Real GDP growth. How much did the quantity of goods and services produced change compared to the last year? So on the vertical axis, we have the real growth. On the horizontal axis, we have the nominal growth. Okay. So the blue lines each blue line represents 1 year in one particular country, one particular G7 country in this case. And therefore, if you plot it starting from 1971 until 2018, you have these points, these blue points. Now, how do you read this graph? The 45-degree line, the orange line, is the zero inflation line. If you are below the orange line, you have positive inflation. If you are above the orange line, you have negative inflation. At the 45-degree line, the orange line, you have zero inflation. So the first striking fact that you see in this graph is missing deflations. So you don't see blue points above the orange line, except for Japan and Canada, but these have very little negative inflations, -1%, -2%. So you don't have -5%, -10%, -20% inflation in this period, right? So that is seen on the left-hand side of the blue cloud, left-hand side. You don't see a lot of deflations. So, but you do see a lot of inflations. If you look at the right-hand side of the cloud, the difference between the orange line and the blue line is inflation, and there is a lot of data points with inflation. These are mostly from 1970s and afterwards. 74, the inflation crisis, oil price shocks of 70s are shown on the right-hand side of the data cloud. So this was motivating us. So there seems to be a structural change in the blue points at some point. So at what point is there a structural break? And then the slope of the blue cloud on the left-hand side is around 0.75, 75%. So if there is a lack of nominal expenditure growth in a country by 10 percentage points, you have a negative impact on real production by 7.5 percentage points on average. So that's our econometric estimate on the left-hand side of the graph. So where is the structural break? So that's our empirical way. So to do that, we are running a regression, a growth regression. On the left-hand side, the dependent variable is real growth. Lowercase y denotes the real production. Uppercase y denotes the nominal production, measured in terms of domestic currency. So we regress the real growth on nominal growth. Okay, and then we focus on the regression coefficient, beta 1. So as you probably have learned from your economics classes, in the classical model, real growth is exogenous. It is not affected by any nominal factor. And therefore, in the model, real growth is a constant, which is the potential growth of the country, plus noise term epsilon. So therefore, since real growth is exogenous, our null hypothesis for the classical model is beta 1 should be 0. So there should be no impact from nominal growth to real growth. That's the null hypothesis of the classical model. How about the problems of the classical model? Is it valid? The answer is it is not valid on the left-hand side of our graph, as you have seen. The changes in nominal growth affects actually real growth, negative. So therefore, classical model is rejected on the left-hand side. So the problem here is inflation is never too negative. There's a downward price rigidity. Prices cannot fall easily to negative. Inflation cannot be too negative. Therefore, production is affected adversely if there's a negative demand shock. So downward demand shocks generate recessions. There is evidence for downward price rigidity. So prices cannot easily fall. How about the Keynesian model? In the Keynesian version, textbook Keynesian version, prices don't change. But if there is a change in nominal demand, that is 1-for-1 reflected on real output, as you have seen in the textbooks. So here, real growth is endogenous. But inflation is exogenous. Inflation is, let's say, at 0 or at 2%, 1% fixed. So if there's a change in nominal expenditure, that is directly reflected to real production. Here, beta 1 coefficient is supposed to be 1. So in the same regression model, you have null hypothesis, beta 1 equals 1. So what's the problem with the Keynesian model? Is it valid? It is not valid on the right-hand side of the graph. So inflation can be very high. Inflation can be very high. Upside demand shocks generate inflation. So there is evidence of upward price flexibility. If demand goes up, prices go up. If demand comes down, production comes down. So that kind of asymmetric price adjustment is there in the data. So let's go back to our graph. How do we decompose this nominal growth to real part and inflation part? I'm going to talk about that. So this is the conceptual diagram. So here you see, again, the same axis, nominal growth, horizontal, real growth, vertical. You can plot the potential growth as the flat bluish or gray line, potential growth rate. For Turkey, this is around 5% in real terms, 5%. If you take the Republican average from 1923, the average of all real growth rates, it's around 5%. In the United States, they estimate that this is around 3%. In Europe, it is less, maybe less than 2%. In Japan, perhaps a little bit less. But anyhow, every country may have a potential growth. That is one curve. That is like a classical prediction. The classical prediction says that there will be potential growth and there will be noise around that on the left-hand side as well. How about the orange one? Orange line is the zero inflation line. So this zero inflation line is important because it is like a non-negativity constraint on inflation. So therefore, if you have positive inflation, you take the difference from the orange line. So if you have a point like the O there is positive inflation. How about negative inflation? If you have a point, data point like that, you take the difference again from the orange line. Now that is a negative inflation. That's a deflation. So what was our problem? Our problem is we don't see a lot of deflations in the data. So if you look at the left-hand side of this cloud, it is violating the classical prediction. If you look at the right-hand side, it is more consistent with the classical prediction, but not consistent with the Keynesian prediction. So this is the conceptual curve. So in textbooks, if you were to write a textbook with this theory, you would have a kinked curve. The left-hand side is the demand deficiency region, where the non-negativity constraint on inflation is binding. So negative demand shocks actually pull down output and production. And right-hand side is more inflationary region. It is harmful inflationary region. So if you can identify the breakpoint, we can also conduct our targeted nominal growth of expenditure. So that's the logic of the study. So with pooled G7 growth data from 1971 to 2018, we are working using two different econometric tests of change, structural change. One of them is the Supremum F test. If you don't know the change point, you take the potential change point for everyone, you conduct an F test, and you take the maximum of the F values. There is a critical value of that, and you test for that. That test finds 5%. Nominal GDP growth as the breakpoint, 5%. There is another test which is also sensitive to changes in volatility, changes in volatility of the error term. That's called SUP-MZ test. It's a likelihood ratio test, those of you who know econometrics. That test finds a change point, a breakpoint at 8% nominal GDP growth. So probably that number, the magic number, is between 5% and 8%. So if you run the regressions that I have shown you, real growth is dependent variable, nominal growth is independent variable. Run the regression under the two regimes. So in this case, we take the 5% as the breakpoint. Below 5% nominal growth, the beta 1 coefficient is around 0.75, as I said. It is a bit higher in United Kingdom, 0.85. It is a bit lower in Canada, 0.48. but they are all significantly positive. So we reject basically the classical model on the values below 5% nominal growth. So it is significantly positive. How about Germany? 0.774, France 0.72, Japan 0.72, United States 0.73. So there is a significant impact of demand deficiency on production. How about the classical region? If you are above 5% nominal expenditure growth, then the coefficients are typically insignificant. They are close to zero, just like the classical model's prediction. So you are on an inflationary part. Real output is not affected by generating too much demand. Only prices go up. The quantities don't go up. That's quite classical. So we have that. The coefficients, which is slightly positive, 0.12 is the coefficient, and t statistic is 2. Other than that, they are insignificant. Model for high values of nominal demand growth. For low values of nominal demand growth, we reject the classical model, and we are closer to the Keynesian model. Not exactly 1, the coefficient is not exactly 1, but it is 0.75. So then the empirical NGD curve would be like this. Its slope will not be -1, +1. Its slope would be 0.75. So if there is a demand deficiency, part of that reduces inflation as well, but only a quarter of it reduces inflation. 3/4 reduces output. So that is very significant cost of demand deficiency. So there is a related literature on this. Number one, there is the missing deflations literature. They call it missing deflations puzzle. Why are prices not flexible downwards? Why don't prices fall when there is demand fall? There is another literature which is focusing on non-linear Phillips curves. So if there is a negative output gap, if demand is less, Phillips curve slope change. So that is also related to this. Another literature about price rigidity. There is a literature on downward wage rigidity. Wages typically don't fall during recessions. That is one reason of price rigidity downwards. There is a tiny literature about downward price rigidity as well, without wages. So there are examples of this wage rigidity literature. It starts from James Tobin, 1972 paper, which basically forcefully argues that optimal inflation target should not be zero. Optimal inflation target should be slightly positive. And therefore, right now in practice, many developed countries target not zero inflation, but 2% inflation. So why not zero but 2%? Based on the Tobin's argument, because there can be from time to time negative demand shocks. If there's a negative demand shock, a small inflation helps actually to reduce real wages. Otherwise, nominal wages don't fall. So there is an economic recession problem or unemployment problem. So inflation, a small inflation, graces the wheels of the economy. That's the argument of James Tobin. And there is a literature that follows from that. Bill Lee has a book, Why Wages Do Not Fall During Recessions, which is a survey-based book. He asks actually to businessmen, to worker unions, why don't you accept a wage cut during a recession? And there are various answers. There are other papers who study the implications on policy, and typically the implication is that there should be some inflation target which is positive. So inflation target should not be zero. But should it be 2%? It depends. It's not worked very much in detail. There is one recent PhD dissertation thesis by Mineyama from University of Pompeu Fabra, I think that's a PhD dissertation. So the author argues that if there is heterogeneity across agents, optimal inflation target should not be 2% for Europe, should be a bit higher, based on downward wage rigidity with heterogeneity. How about the non-linear Phillips curves? There are many papers, but two of them are here. For instance, Bob and Detmeister studied US metropolitan data to show that the slope of the Phillips curve is different during booms versus during recessions. International evidence is presented in Christian Forbes and others paper. How about missing deflations? Harding and others published a recent paper about missing deflation. They try to explain it. And another paper is Atkinson and Kehoe, they have data, global data on deflations, and they do find episodes of deflations, although they are rare. So they have a data set including emerging markets, and they focus on good deflations. So deflations are not totally missing, but they are rare. That's the finding. Now, this brings us to policy implication. So our suggestion could be one should consider nominal growth targeting as a supporting policy objective to inflation targeting. So don't focus on inflation target only, but also have an eye on how much nominal growth is there in your country. And therefore, there are a few papers about that, but very few. One of them is very famous, Woodford, Michael Woodford, who has the book on interest and prices, the basis of modern central banking, actually. But in a conference, so he said that nominal growth targeting could also be good supporting measure. There is also a paper by Bennett McCallum, a monetary economist. He also thinks that it could be optimal from a timeless perspective. So these are very few papers who suggest nominal growth targeting could be good. Woodford's quotation from the conference paper. So he said that indeed nominal growth targeting can be viewed as a modern version of Friedman's K% rule proposal, in which the variable that Friedman cared about stabilizing, the growth rate of nominal income, replaces the monetary argument. Okay. So if you remember the K% rule of Friedman, so he suggested that broad money aggregate, like M2, the bank money, should grow at, let's say, 5% or 6%, 7% every year. That should be the rule. And then you don't need a central bank. If you can do it, it will be like automatic stabilization. So Woodford's argument is that instead of money growth, you can focus on nominal demand growth and give a target like 5% or 6% for the United States, and try to make sure that the money, in terms of money, your demand grows at every year 5%. So 2% of that will be inflation, 3% of it will be potential growth for the United States. That makes sense. Okay. So conclusions. A nominal GDP growth rate between 5 to 8% would be reasonable for the G7 countries. Currently, after COVID, we are above 8%. We are above 8% nominal growth in the United States. We are above 8% in Europe. Not so much in Japan, but these countries suffer from very high inflation, as you see. Below 5% corresponds to a demand deficiency region, and in that region, expansionary policies, expansionary monetary policy, expansionary fiscal policy would be called for. Above 8%, it corresponds to a harmful inflation region. In that region, stabilization policies would be called for. It simplifies actually the diagnosis. What would be further work after this paper? Nominal growth anchor as a supporting regime to inflation targeting could be a good idea, maybe. Nominal growth targeting in comparison to nominal GDP level targeting, because there is a issue on GDP level targeting, nominal GDP level. This is about change in GDP, not the level of GDP. That contrast could be made. Country-specific real potential growth rates should be taken into account. For instance, Europe has a lower potential growth rate than the United States. And custom-tailored nominal growth targets. What should be the nominal growth target for Europe? What should be the nominal growth target for Japan? What should be the nominal growth target for the United States? These questions can be asked separately rather than pooled data. So this is the end of my talk. And thank you for your attention and invitation.
Thank you very much, our Governor, Professor Başçı, for your very informative and detailed presentation. Is there any questions from the audience? Any question? May I ask a question? You have found that nominal GDP GDP growth target is can be used. It's supporting the inflation target regime, and we already, using inflation targeting regime. So for Turkey, could you recommend to use the nominal growth rate targeting together with the inflation targeting regime?
That would actually be a good idea, but of course the change point, the structural break point would not be 5% for our country because our potential growth rate is higher than the United States. So if you assume it is 5%, our reference point for nominal, ideal nominal GDP growth would be higher than 5%, 8% range. Let us just say that, let us be a bit optimistic on the growth, and let us say that it is 10% for the sake of example. Nominal growth rate of 10% would be good, let's say, for our country. What is it right now? Just check the data. It is close to 100%. So there's a long way actually to go from 100% all the way down to 10%. So that's a supporting indicator and measure, which could be useful. But we did not run the same regression for emerging markets yet.
Any questions or comments? Yes.
Do you have any predictions for future economic performance of the Turkish economy? Next year or the year after, how is going to be the
Nowadays, I try to focus not on the Turkish economy because I have served as the ambassador of Turkey at the OECD. So that's why I was focused more on the OECD's problems, which seemed like a demand deficiency problem when we wrote this paper. But interestingly, after I retired from Foreign Office, it turned out that they also have an inflation problem. And interestingly, this paper also answers why there was inflation, because during COVID period, they have stimulated nominal demand so much that it came to slightly double-digit levels. And that, according to this paper, was supposed to generate inflation, not too much growth, but inflation, and it did. So my focus was more on the developed countries recently. And in the near term, I don't really plan to work too much on the Turkish economy because there are lots of people working and talking about the Turkish economy. I think these discussions are healthy. I think the lessons derived from developed countries may also be relevant for emerging market economies. And this is a very simple framework, actually, to answer many questions.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
First of all, thanks for came to here, and it was a really good topic, and you explained very well. Thanks for everything. My question is, as you know, actually, as far as I know, there is no specific solution for inflation, and we are the students, and we have limited budget. We just take some money from our parents, and we try to live. We try to survive, and what should we do with limited budget? I mean, should we invest or should we try to live rich life, or should we do something about our budget? Yeah, what's your suggestions about how students can protect themselves with inflation?
No, I mean, it's not easy to generalize, but a typical student, an average student, probably would not be able to save, I guess. So if you can just cover your food expenses and shelter needs, that would be good for you. But the most important problem is to improve your abilities by focusing on your coursework and succeeding actually in graduation. And in the meantime, don't ignore internship. Do you have internship here?
Yes, we have.
So internship is also a very good idea. So just focus on your abilities, coursework and internship. And after graduation, of course, still you will not be able to save too much. That typically you will not be able to save too much because as you start your job, a typical pattern is that you borrow a little bit. You don't save, but you borrow on average. But if your family is very rich, of course you can think about saving alternatives. But for you, I wouldn't recommend thinking too much about saving. Just survive and improve yourself.
Okay, thank you so much.
Is there any other questions? No. Thank you very much, Professor Bayçı, for taking your time and to come to our university and giving such a insightful and informative presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Şey, yalan mı aldı dersin normalde? O bugün aldılar.